In the summer of 1912, in a small, quiet town in southwestern Iowa, 8 people went to sleep in their beds and never woke up. 6 of them were children. The youngest was 5 years old. More than a century later, no one has ever been convicted of their murders. The killer's identity remains one of the great unsolved mysteries in American criminal history. And the house where it happened still stands today, boarded, restored, and, according to hundreds of visitors who have stayed the night since, very far from empty. This is the true story of the Villisca Axe Murders. Villisca, Iowa, in 1912 was the kind of town where doors were left unlocked at night, not out of carelessness, but because nobody could imagine a reason to lock them. It had a population of a little over 2,000 people, several churches, a handful of small businesses, and the particular close-knit familiarity of a community where almost everyone knew almost everyone else. Josiah B. Moore, known to most as Joe, was one of the town's more prominent citizens. At 43 years old, he ran a successful farm implement business, and by most accounts was well-liked, hard-working, and respected. His wife, Sarah, 39, was active in the community, and at the time of the murders was serving as the coordinator of the local Presbyterian Church's Children's Day program. Together they had 4 children: Herman, 11, Mary Catherine, 10, Arthur, 7, and Paul, the youngest, at just 5 years old. On the evening of Sunday, June 9, 1912, the Moore family attended the Children's Day service at their church, an event Sarah herself had helped organize. Mary Catherine had invited 2 young friends to join them and to spend the night afterward: sisters Ina Mae Stillinger, age 8, and Lena Gertrude Stillinger, age 11, who came from a farming family living several miles outside of town. The girl's older sister gave permission for the sleepover over the phone. It was, by every account, an entirely ordinary end to an entirely ordinary Sunday. The program ended around 9:30 in the evening. The Moore family and the 2 Stillinger girls walked the short distance home together through the quiet summer streets of Villisca and settled in for the night. Joe and Sarah retired to the upstairs master bedroom. Their 4 children slept in a room down the same hallway. The 2 young guests, Ina and Lena, were given the downstairs guest bedroom. None of them would live to see the sunrise. Investigators would later piece together, as best they could, the sequence of that night. Though even now, more than 100 years later, significant parts of it remain uncertain. Sometime after midnight, someone entered the Moore house. The doors, as was common in Villisca at the time, were unlocked. Whoever entered did not go for the 2 young girls sleeping just inside the front of the house. Instead, according to the physical evidence, they moved directly through the downstairs and up the staircase, with what investigators would later describe as an unsettling, almost practiced familiarity with the layout of a house that was not their own. They took an oil lamp from a table as they went, removing its chimney glass so that it burned low and dim, just enough light to see by, not enough to be noticed from outside. And they carried, or found within the house, an axe, believed by investigators to have belonged to the Moore family itself, taken from their own coal shed. The attack began in the master bedroom, where Joe and Sarah Moore were asleep. Doctors who later examined the bodies concluded that Joe had been struck with far greater force and repetition than any other victim in the house. The blade of the axe used against him specifically, rather than the blunt back, with the damage to his face severe enough that his eyes were no longer visible in the aftermath. Whether this reflects a personal rage directed specifically at Joe Moore, or simply where the attack began before a pattern set in, is something investigators have debated for over a century. The killer then moved into the children's room down the hall. Herman, Catherine, Arthur, and young Paul were bludgeoned in their beds in the same manner, repeated blows to the head, delivered while they slept, using the blunt end of the axe. There is no evidence any of them were awake or aware in their final moments. It is, if there is any mercy at all to be found in this story, the closest this case comes to offering one. The killer returned briefly to the master bedroom, inflicting additional wounds on the Moores, before finally descending the stairs to the ground floor, where Ina and Lena Stillinger lay asleep in the guest room the family had given them for the night. The younger girl, Ina, was killed in the same manner as the others, quickly, in her sleep without apparent struggle. Lena was different. Investigators found evidence suggesting she had woken during the attack. A possible defensive wound to her arm, her body positioned differently than the others, her nightgown disturbed in a way that immediately raised difficult questions. A doctor's examination at the time concluded she had not been sexually assaulted, but the specific, unsettling detail of her body being found differently arranged than every other victim in the house has remained for over 100 years. One of the case's most disturbing and most debated unanswered questions. Some researchers believe she simply woke and struggled during the attack. Others have raised the possibility of an additional motive the historical record has never been able to confirm. What the killer did next is, in some ways, the detail that has haunted investigators and armchair researchers alike for over a century, because it suggests something far more disturbing than simple, frenzied violence. Before leaving the house, the killer methodically covered every mirror and pane of glass in the home, hanging aprons and skirts from the Moore family's own closets over the windows and door frames, as though deliberately ensuring that no reflection and no view from outside could catch whatever they were doing or whatever they had already done. They washed their hands in a basin of water left in the kitchen. They found a plate of uneaten beans and bread in the pantry, prepared themselves a small meal, and ate it at the family's own kitchen table. And then, sometime around 5 o'clock in the morning, they let themselves out through the same door they'd entered, locking it carefully behind them with a house key. By all outward appearances, the Moore house sat in perfect, undisturbed silence for the rest of that morning. A small, tidy white farmhouse on a quiet street, indistinguishable from any other, while 8 bodies lay inside. It was a neighbor, Mary Peckham, who first grew concerned. By 7 o'clock, the Moore family, normally punctual, reliable people, had not emerged to begin their usual morning routine. Peckham knocked. No one answered. She tried the door and found it locked, which was itself unusual enough to alarm her. She called for Joe's brother, Ross Moore, who lived nearby. Ross arrived, let himself into the house using a spare key, and left Peckham waiting on the porch while he went inside alone. He found the bodies of Ina and Lena Stillinger first in the downstairs guest room. He did not go further into the house. He came back out, told Peckham to summon the town marshal, and waited. What followed once law enforcement arrived was, by the standards of any era, but especially by the standards of small-town Iowa policing in 1912, a catastrophe of contamination and mishandling. Word spread through Villisca almost immediately. Neighbors, town officials, and curious onlookers moved freely through the house in the hours after the discovery, long before any systematic examination of the crime scene could take place. Furniture was touched. Floors were walked across. Whatever physical evidence might have existed, footprints, fingerprints, any trace of the killer's presence, was very likely disturbed, contaminated, or destroyed before investigators from outside Villisca ever had a chance to examine the scene themselves. It is, in hindsight, one of the central tragedies of the entire case. Not just that 8 people were murdered, but that the town's own shock and disbelief in the immediate aftermath may have cost investigators any real chance of identifying who did it. The Moore and Stillinger funeral was held in Villisca's town square on June 12, 1912, just 3 days after the murders. Contemporary accounts describe thousands of mourners in attendance, an almost unimaginable turnout for a town of only 2,000 residents, drawn from across the entire region by the scale and horror of what had happened. The investigation that followed would stretch on, in various forms, for nearly a decade. It would end 2 political careers, produce 2 criminal trials, spawn a slander lawsuit, and ultimately result in the passage of new state legislation establishing what would eventually become Iowa's modern Bureau of Criminal Investigation. And at the end of all of it, after grand juries, private detectives, confessions, and courtroom drama, no one would ever be convicted. Several theories emerged almost immediately, and each deserves its own examination, because none of them were ever conclusively ruled out. The first serious suspect was a traveling minister named Reverend George Kelly, an English-born preacher who had come to Villisca just 2 days before the murders to lead the very same Children's Day program the Moore family had attended. By multiple accounts, Kelly was an unusual, unsettling figure, described by those who knew him as having suffered a mental breakdown as a younger man and accused on several occasions of inappropriate behavior toward young women and girls, including reportedly asking them to pose for him. Kelly left Villisca early on the morning of June 10th, sometime between 5 and 6 a.m., by most accounts, hours before the bodies were even discovered. In the weeks that followed, rather than distancing himself from the case, Kelly appeared to develop what investigators and journalists at the time described as an unhealthy fascination with it. He wrote numerous unsolicited letters to police, to investigators, and even to the grieving families, offering details and theories about the crime that struck several recipients as inappropriately intimate given his supposed distance from the case. A private investigator eventually wrote back to Kelly, testing him, asking pointed questions about details of the crime scene that had not been made public. Kelly's replies, describing sounds he claimed to have heard and details he claimed to have observed, only deepened suspicion. Was Kelly a deeply disturbed man, simply obsessed with a horrifying local tragedy? Or did his unsettling familiarity with details of the case suggest something far more direct? Kelly was eventually charged and tried twice for the murders. His first trial, in 1917, ended in a hung jury. During legal proceedings connected to the case, Kelly reportedly gave a confession to the killings, but when he was tried a second time, the jury did not believe it and acquitted him. Kelly walked free, and the case against him, despite the deeply strange behavior that had first drawn investigators' attention, was never revived. The second major theory implicated one of the most powerful men in the state, Iowa State Senator Frank F. Jones. Jones was, by most contemporary accounts, an aggressive, ambitious businessman and politician, and one who had, according to persistent local rumor, harbored a deep and specific hatred toward Joe Moore himself. Moore had once worked for Jones before leaving to start his own competing farm implement business, reportedly taking valuable clients and business relationships with him when he left. A betrayal, in Jones's eyes, that some believed he never forgave. Suspicion around Jones grew so intense and so damaging to his political career and public reputation that it effectively ended his standing in Iowa politics. Even though he was never formally charged and no direct evidence was ever produced connecting him to the killings themselves, some townspeople, including Joe Moore's own brother Ross and the father of the murdered Stillinger sisters, reportedly remained convinced of Jones's guilt for the rest of their lives, believing he had hired someone else to carry out the killings on his behalf. A third theory emerged years later and, in some ways, remains the most chilling of all, because it suggests the Villisca murders may not have been an isolated event at all, but one entry in a string of eerily similar crimes. A private investigator named J.N. Wilkerson became convinced that a man named William Blackie Mansfield was responsible, not just for the Villisca murders, but for a series of nearly identical axe killings across several states, including the murder of his own wife, infant child, and in-laws in Illinois 2 years later, along with additional similar killings in Kansas and elsewhere. In each case, according to Wilkerson's investigation, the pattern was consistent almost to the point of ritual. Victims bludgeoned to death with an axe while sleeping, mirrors in the house deliberately covered, a burning oil lamp left with its chimney removed, and a basin of water left behind where the killer had apparently washed his hands afterward. Wilkerson claimed he could place Mansfield at each crime scene on the relevant nights. But payroll records eventually surfaced showing Mansfield working several hundred miles away, in Illinois, at the time of the Villisca murders specifically, an alibi strong enough that he was released for lack of evidence. And the theory, however compelling its pattern matching, was never proven. Beyond Kelly, Jones, and Mansfield, additional theories and minor suspects surfaced over the following years, including a mysterious man seen near the house that night, other individuals with violent histories in the region, and even speculation, never substantiated, about ritual or religiously motivated explanations tied to the specific way Linus Stillinger's body was found. None of these theories were ever proven. None of them were ever fully eliminated either. By the early 1920s, after nearly a decade of investigation, multiple grand juries, 2 trials, and enormous public and political pressure, the case went cold. It has remained officially unsolved to this day. One of the longest-running unresolved mass murders in American history. The house itself did not disappear the way so many crime scenes eventually do. For decades, it stood largely unchanged, passing through a succession of private owners, its layout and structure preserved almost exactly as it had been on the night of the murders. No major renovations were undertaken. No one, it seems, wanted to be the one to fundamentally alter a house with that history. It wasn't until the mid-1990s that the property's modern era truly began. A couple purchased the home in 1995 with the specific intention of restoring it to its exact 1912 condition, stripping away whatever modest modernizations had accumulated over 80 years and returning the house, room by room, to precisely how it had looked on the night the Moore family and the Stillinger sisters died. In 1997, the property was formally added to the National Register of Historic Places under its original owners' names, the Josiah B. and Sarah Moore House. But it wasn't historical preservation that made the house famous again. It was what visitors began reporting once it reopened its doors. This time, not as a family home, but as a tourist destination offering both daytime tours and, for those bold enough, the option to spend the entire night inside. The claims that have emerged since the house reopened are, by now, extensive and consistent enough that they've become almost as central to the Villisca story as the murders themselves. Visitors and staff have reported disembodied voices, particularly the sound of children, in rooms that were empty at the time. Overnight guests have described objects moving on their own, doors opening and closing without explanation, and the sound of footsteps on the stairs in the dead of night, in a house where every other living guest was accounted for. Some visitors claim to have seen or felt the distinct impression of a small child sitting on the edge of a bed. Others report a heavy, oppressive sense of dread specifically in the children's bedroom and the downstairs guest room, the 2 rooms where, history tells us, the youngest victims died. In 2014, an overnight visitor sustained a serious injury during a paranormal investigation of the house, an incident unrelated to the original 1912 crime, but one that only deepened the property's modern reputation as a site of genuine, ongoing paranormal activity. It's worth pausing here, as we did with Borley Rectory, to consider this part of the story with a clear and honest eye. The Villisca house today operates as a business, one whose primary appeal and primary source of revenue is precisely its reputation for being haunted. That doesn't necessarily mean every account from every visitor is fabricated. Old houses genuinely do creak, settle, and produce unexplained sounds, especially houses with the specific wooden frame construction of a 1912 Iowa farmhouse. The power of suggestion is also undeniably powerful. Visitors who arrive already primed by the house's horrific history and its modern reputation for hauntings are, understandably, far more likely to interpret an ordinary creak or draft as something more. But it's also true that paranormal claims connected to Villisca predate its modern tourism industry by decades. Quiet, informal stories among locals about the house being uneasy, even unwelcoming, long before anyone thought to charge admission for an overnight stay. Whether that reflects something genuinely unexplained lingering in a house, or simply the natural, human tendency for a place associated with unspeakable tragedy to accumulate ghost stories over time, is a question this case, like so many others, cannot definitively answer. What can be said with certainty is this. On a summer night in 1912, 8 people, a mother, a father for children, and 2 young guests who had done nothing more than accept an invitation to a sleepover, were murdered in their beds by someone who has never been identified and never faced justice. The house they died in still stands. It has been preserved, almost frozen, in the exact condition it was in that night. The same layout, the same rooms, the same staircase the killer climbed carrying a dimmed oil lamp and an axe taken from the family's own shed. Every year, people travel from across the country to spend the night inside it. Some come for the history. Some come hoping to feel something they can't otherwise explain. And some, by their own accounts, leave having heard something, a footstep, a whisper the soft, unmistakable sound of a child's voice in an empty room that they have never been able to rationalize away. More than 110 years later, the Villisca Axe Murders remain exactly what they were the morning Mary Peckham first knocked on that door and got no answer. An open case, a house full of unanswered questions, and 8 people who never got the chance to tell anyone what really happened that night. Thank you for watching. If this story kept you up tonight, subscribe to the Fear Spot for more true documented cases where nightmares come alive.